Well, I knew when I saw the schedule I was going to be in trouble. In 1992, I had a similar thing happen. There was a conference at MIT on some equally arcane subjects, and lo and behold, I ended up following John Mack, who, kind of like Stephen, gave a transformational speech, and you go, what do I do after this? Because I live primarily in the cognitive domain, and you get up here and with the rah-rah stuff. So, one of the questions I get asked very frequently is, what has remote viewing really done? I'm going to get to the secrecy issue in a minute, but I'm really going to follow up on, tell you a little bit about Stephen that he has mentioned only tangentially, and a few of you heard it last year. About a year ago, Victoria and I were taking a tour of Egypt, which, by the way, if you haven't done it, I think people should put on a do not miss in your lifetime, something that really should be done. But anyway, while we were there, we talked to the people about the finds in Alexandria, because about 3 years ago, there was a French team of archaeologists, and they were making worldwide news about the underwater archaeology that was being done off the coast of Alexandria. Some of you may remember the articles about that. What's really interesting is 20 years ago, Stephen had a team of archaeologists who had done the same finding. And by the way, is Alex still in print? Is that available? Okay. Stephen, 20 years ago, had actually gone out there. They did some underwater dives, enough to document it. They did a television special on it. He wrote a book called The Alexandria Project. The reason that they couldn't follow up at that time was the bay was contaminated, and when they put the divers in the water, the medical experts just went wild and said, you cannot dive with this amount of raw sewage. But I just offer that as when you say what's actually been done, and in the Alexandria Project, you'll hear about some three-dimensional finding sites that were not ever known before. I mean, it wasn't like you were finding something and you've got clues to take you to it and then you get lucky. He was working with Pat Price and Hella Hammond and actually found some things out there. Another thing, and oh, by the way, we talked about this issue where Stephen did of nation states. Actually, I don't know how many years ago, but a number of years ago, Stephen and I wrote an article together, and we talked specifically about that issue, that what we saw coming, and this was not from psychic input, but looking from political science as well, saying we think that the notion of the nation state is going to change dramatically. As I mentioned, we have adjusted this. I'll mention this just as a quick add. Unfortunately, they didn't get copies of the book available. We understood they were going to have some. I got just a couple of copies. But yeah, in real life, I don't really work in these domains at all. I've been working more primarily in the area of non-lethal weapons and been fortunate to have some pretty big support. One of the things I notice when I read the internet, if you put my name in there, you'll come across some really interesting things. And you kind of wonder who they're talking about at times, particularly if you know it. But because of that, when I talk to groups, I say, okay, here are the rules, because people often say, oh, we're lying to you and misinformation and all of that. So what I want to do is say, here's the rules from my perspective. I'll tell you the truth. There's no disinformation, the kind of things. I'm going to talk specifically about issues of secrecy, and some of the things you'll find written about me, I think you'll find it's quite surprising, because I really haven't gone on the record on this topic before this. I do have active clearances. Are there things I won't tell you? Yes, but I'll tell you what I won't tell you. If I just say I'm not going to address that. And I'm going to talk about some specific projects in which some of it's going to have to be fairly generic, just because the nature of the project itself. But I'll tell you that I'm not going to do that. And if I do, please don't try to rephrase the question and come up with some fancy way to get around it. I'm not going to tell you that. Since secrecy is the issue, I thought it might be worth starting with what is secrecy? And this is not going to, can we drop the lights some? We got anybody who's handling the lights near the ones near the front here particularly? Basically it says a secret, you know, what is, I just went to the dictionary. A secret is something that is kept from the knowledge of other people. But there's a number of reasons that we have secrets. One is to preserve security. And I'll submit that there are a lot of reasons why certain things should be secret. I'll give you probably the classic example. Remember when we were developing what was the stealth fighter? It was F-117. That was what we called a war winner. The stealth technology was, remember this was the bad old days, we were still fighting the Soviet Union, the Warsaw Pact. We needed to come up with something that offset the massive numbers that we were going to face for war in Central Europe. We were talking about national survival as a key issue. That technology was the kind of thing that was going to allow us to penetrate the extensive air defenses of the former Soviet Union and destroy the command and control structure. And when and how and where you were going to do that, I think is an appropriate use of security. On the other hand, sometimes we classify things to prevent embarrassment. And we found out things that can't stand the light of day, you really don't want them examined very closely, so that if you classify it, a lot of people won't see it. This particularly is true in operations, where you get into operations that might be a little sticky if they were put out. But one of the major issues is power. Secrecy is power. It allows for power. It allows you to establish and maintain power. I submit this is not an appropriate use, but it is one that's probably one of the predominant uses of secrecy is for power. Remember, I'm not necessarily talking here about state secrecy. Individuals do the same thing. Certainly corporations do this sort of thing, you know, corporate secrets and all that. Probably appropriate in some areas, maybe less than others. Because we also find out that because the lack of sharing of information prevents advances in many areas. But I also want to emphasize that the bottom bullet is there are many reasons, legitimate reasons, for secrecy. There's a lot of misnomers about secrecy itself, so I thought I would run through some of the categories. FOUO, for official use only, basically says don't tell the newspapers. You know, most of the stuff is common sense and out there and eventually leaks out anyway. Then there are three major categories: the confidential, secret, and top secret. And of course, everybody's favorite, above top secret. And we hear about that all the time. Well, first of all, there is no such category, any place, anyway, of above top secret. That doesn't mean there aren't things that are more sensitive than other sorts of things. And I put some of the things up there that are of interest. There are what are called caveats. These are names. This is the way you compartment it. When the program that you heard of initially, you saw some of the names before: Grill Flame, Stargate, some of the other. I mentioned the F-117. That was developed as Have Blue when it was a DARPA program, when it was still in a developmental stage. So they have caveats, so there are ways to talk about it. So usually when you hear above top secret, that usually means it's a compartmented program and something like that. However, having said that, I mean, there's a book out by that specific title. Now, just because you have clearance for whatever level, and that doesn't mean you have all knowledge of it. Now, that's one of the misperceptions. People say, well, if you're in the government, if you have a top secret clearance, you must know X, Y, and Z. Not necessarily true at all. This need to know is really kind of key, because it says who is going to be allowed in. So your job, the kinds of things that you're doing, are the ones that tell you whether or not you're going to be allowed into any of these specific things. Another one that is very popular is one that's called eyes only, and I think this is another area that's largely misunderstood. The eyes-only technique was really set up for senior officials to talk to each other in what's called back channel, a way that they can say, I want to send you my opinion on a such and thing without it being, on the record, a formal document. In other words, what's a policy? A policy is coming up. We're going to discuss the policy. I want to give you, here's my opinion on this and my opinion on that. Because once the policy is firmly established, then it may have a classification level or be released, but it will be the official organizational policy. So just because it means eyes only, all that means was there were senior officials who wanted to talk about it. Because, if you thought about it, do you really think that these senior guys that went around do the encryption? No. There are people, there were clerks and all that who handled this sort of information. So it rarely is truly eyes only, as most people tend to think. I want to talk a little bit, and these are going to be some personal examples of how secrecy can really hurt individuals or projects or things of that nature. The first one up here is called Stingray. In an earlier incarnation, my last job was as the Director of Advanced Systems Concepts for Army Laboratory Command. And as such, I was involved in the development of all tactical directed energy systems. And we had an interesting program called Stingray, which was, we were worried about how the Soviets were going to approach, again, the war in Central Europe. And we knew how to kill tanks, but the problem was they came with lots of friends and neighbors, and you wanted to have a system that could stop them from seeing you. So this was a laser system that basically would reach out. It would craze the optics of enemy tanks coming in. Not much exciting here. Interesting program. Parallel to Stingray was a separate program. Another technology, it was another laser technology being developed in the black world. This thing was so black that there were very, very few people, even in the military, who knew about the new technology that was coming along. Quite frankly, it was smaller, it looked much more promising and everything else. In the meantime, the Stingray program was going around getting constituents that were being briefed to lots and lots of people, and the other technology was known only by a few. So finally, a few years later, they said, it's now time to release the information. Again, it was classified, but we're now going to tell all of the users about the other technology. And they went, so what? We know Stingray, dropped the other, and they ended up with the program being killed. What had happened was, it was so secret that by the time it came to fruition, it was going to be brought in, the user said, I don't care. I understand this other one. This is the one I want. Kill it. And so the secrecy ended up killing the program. The Tet Offensive. This is another one that gets real personal. At that time, I was a Special Forces commander in Vietnam. And I was in the Mekong Delta. And we did not have a lot of American units down in the Delta. And where I was, we had no American units. I had about 15 Americans and about 1,200 indigenous. I actually paid mercenaries and everyone to work for us. I went to Canton to do some paperwork. If you remember back that far, those who were old enough, keep forgetting that a lot of younger folks don't even remember back that far. But Tet was this huge offensive. Now, early in the Vietnam War, we used to have breaks. We'd go on a holiday, and like over Christmas they do it. Tet was a Vietnamese holiday. Both sides would sign a truce. You'd have a ceasefire, and everybody pretty much went along with it. But in 1968, the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong decided they were going to use that cover to launch a major attack. My point there was that down in the Delta where we were, We had no idea it was coming. And it wasn't until I saw a CBS program years later in which they had taken General Westmoreland and Danny Graham to find out the senior people had known this attack was coming. The problem was in our area, we had no idea that a major offensive was about to be launched, and we lost, where I was in the Delta, we lost every political capital in the entire Delta. Again, I mean, and this was, you know, our lives are on the line, and yet in that case, I think secrecy hurt us quite a bit. The next one is one I'm going to talk real generally to, but again, when secrecy hurts. I was in with a number of other people. In fact, there's General Stubblebine, who's been mentioned a number of times, and I and some people from the various agencies that you know by letters were in briefing General Abramson. And Abe at that time was the director of SDI. And it was a huge program. It was the biggest program probably in defense. At that time, they had a $5 billion annual budget. And so we were in talking to him about a project, and we said, well, we want to show you some information on you know, what the Soviets have been saying about this. And we laid out some very, very specific information. And he looks at that and says, wow. You know, how do you know this? And we said, well, there are special sources and methods. It can't be divulged and all of that. But we have a very high assurance that the information that we have, you know, presented here is extremely accurate. So, wow, that's interesting. Can they do that? You know, in other words, do the Soviets have the capability to access this kind of information? By the way, it was not remote viewing. This was real hard data. And we said, yeah, we think that their collection capability is pretty comparable to ours in this area. And it blew him away. Now, what surprised me is here was a 3-star general running the largest program in the military at that time. Again, $5 billion program, didn't know he was vulnerable. I think that hurts. A physics example. This is one I've got to be very generic on, but some physicists in the U.S. found what we would call a phenomena, that a certain way that a certain kind of physics worked, and we thought, boy, that you know we're the only one. You know, I have a word that I used in Future War called cerebral centrism. I think it's a major problem with Americans. We tend to think we're the only smart people in the world. And this really shows up when you get into scientific conferences. And I got to tell you, you know, chemistry, physics, science works the same across the board. So we had this, you know, in order to be, you had to, you know, slice your wrist and sign in blood and all of those sorts of things. And I was involved in, this had to do with, in the non-lethal area actually, and I was involved with NATO studies. We went into a meeting one day, and the French came in and just laid this program on the table. The German who was sitting next to me says, well, ours is about this big and all this. How big is yours? And we're sitting there choking. The problem was that led to vulnerability of a lot of different weapon systems. We thought the people who were developing it in the U.S. had this in a really tight box. Obviously, other people had already figured this out, and yet the people who didn't know about it were U.S. commanders who were vulnerable. There's a couple of big ones I'm going to get to. I'm going to talk about the influence of secrecy on remote viewing itself, as well as, you know, there were some big issues on the Soviet Union. One of the things I will hit probably repeatedly is this issue of conspiracy theories, because it's certainly endemic in the U.S. and I think growing, and I think secrecy happens to support that and foster it. This may be a little small. Anybody knowing my political bent, if I ever said I was going to be in supporting Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you'd have probably said I was absolutely crazy. But having said that, Senator Moynihan wrote a book called Secrecy. It was really pretty good because it talks about the problems of secrecy on a very broad scale. It said, and these are some quotes taken from it, it prevented the American government from accurately assessing the enemy. I had on there the fall of the Soviet Union. We didn't see it coming. We frankly didn't see it coming. As a matter of fact, if you had looked at intelligence estimates, and we looked at the amount of money that was being spent in the defense sector, and then you compared that with the American, we were actually supposed to hit a crossover point where the former Soviet Union was going to be having a stronger economy and spending more more money on defense than the West. Now, as Senator Moynihan pointed out, the problem was you had intelligence analysts talking to other intelligence analysts. He said if you had brought in people who were traveling in the former Soviet Union, if you brought in economists and showed them the kind of projections you'd have made, they would have said, this is nonsense, because we knew from people who were traveling over there, yeah, there was a lot of bluster, and they had the May Day parades and all of those sorts of things, but on the other hand, the infrastructure was falling apart. Can they grow a lot of wheat? Yeah, they can grow a lot of wheat, but you can't get it to market. Didn't have the road infrastructure, didn't have communications, and what happened was, as we know very quickly, with perestroika, we saw the collapse of the former Soviet Union, and it caught most intelligence analysts by mistake. Another problem is, says the actors involved seem hardly to know the set of roles they play. Most important, they never know the damage they do. One of the problems that I've seen with classification is that they push the levels down to very, very low. And remember I said there are 3 issues, and power being one of them. So one of the things you do is you create a fiefdom by being the person who sets the level of classification for your project, so you prevent the information from spreading. And with that, damage incurs, but usually the person is not at a level to even understand that they caused that kind of damage. This is also, conspiracy theories have been part of the American culture for 2 centuries, but they appear to have grown in dimension and public conception in recent decades. What I suggest here is we've always had, maybe in population of the number of millions that we've had, anytime been over 200 million, you got tens of thousands of people who are really disgruntled. We have tax revolts going on and all kinds of things. The difference that I see today, and I look quite a bit at this conspiracy, that number has now grown to tens of millions of people in the United States who are really upset and very concerned. I got off a little bit on the political. I've been sort of involved in the Waco issue. And one of the things that concerns me there is the judge has been treating Waco as if it were another case. I think the people who are watching what happened at Waco, the government has lost total credibility in my estimation in these areas. And it is a kind of thing that because of that and Ruby Ridge and a number of incidents that are getting publicized, this idea of trust in the government has been diminished. I have friends who have been in the FBI, and they said, our credibility, our ability to get information out there is based on our personal credibility. To go in and say, we're from the premier law enforcement agency of the United States. And in many cases, that's now being lost. And and the problem again, I think that secrecy tends to foster the conspiracy issue. Now, secrecy and remote viewing, how is that? I think there were times when it was very applicable. It protected the program early on when it was quite vulnerable. And there have been periods, one of the things about the remote viewing program over time, it has been what I would call personality dependent. In other words, you had a few people who were in key places keeping the program alive. Some of them you heard about, some you didn't. Some of these people, by the way, were on the Hill. Because remember the golden rule and all of that. Who has the gold makes the rule. And you had to get the gold had to come down from the Hill through appropriation. So you had to have key people in place to keep the program going. And when they were worried about the giggle factor and that sorts of things, There were times when the program was protected. It also made some of what the intelligence community calls customers. These are the people who come to you and say, I have a problem, I need information, and they are taskers. And they were worried about being seen as individually as vulnerable as well. So if they could go in a classified program, they didn't have to reveal that they were going to psychics to get information. You're going to hear from Bevy Yeager, and who work with the Psi Squad. She works with a lot of police departments. Many of them feel the same way. They go law enforcement agencies who use and get psychic information. It's almost always used in the court of last resort. In other words, it's used when you have absolutely no other way to get the information, but they would like it, in many cases, not known that they're getting or using unusual means for obtaining information. Thus it was with the remote viewing program. Many of the people who would use it, if you went back and say, did you get the information from, grill flame? I mean, they would just deny that that's where the information came from. However, on the other side of it, it also contributed to the demise of the program. As you remember, in 1995, what really happened at that point was that the program was in DIA and they wanted to move it to CIA. And there were political forces within CIA who said, I really don't want this back. And at the same time, you had people on the Hill who said, I want the program to continue. So there was a funding issue. So the compromise here was that what they would do is they would run an independent study. And based on the independent study, they would determine whether or not they were going to continue the program. Now, Jessica Utz is due in, and she was one of the people who's brought in as an independent reviewer and is going to talk, I don't know if she'll talk about here, but probably will talk about after actually reviewing the analysis of remote viewing studies. But part of the problem was, all of a sudden, this was getting a much higher visibility, and the people that had to support it, the leadership in CIA, were just saying, I don't know about this, sounds too weird to me, and the independent study was a way to kill it. I mean, it was pretty well set up from the start. So you did not have sufficient numbers of people who had access to the actual information, and particularly the senior decision makers had very little information about the program, about its work, about the successes, about the probability of success, where it could be and be used effectively. And thus you came up with, they ended up killing the program because you did not. This is like the Stingray thing. Once it was uncovered, you didn't have the political support to keep it in place. More recently, it has produced charlatans. We got a guy in Las Vegas who, among things, claims that he was in the program. Interestingly, he was a neurosurgeon, and he also was an SR-71 pilot. That's, the super fast Blackbirds and all of that. And you start looking at these and you say, wait a minute, ain't no way you're going to have that set of skills put together. But you have a lot of people out on the net and every other place coming up and saying, IR1, Now, the reality is the group is pretty small, and they do know each other. But even within the people who are in there are claims that are being made that are stretched quite a bit. And hence I say that one of the reasons the secrecy has helped to produce the charlatans, because there's almost no way to backtrack and no way for the public to figure out which of the claims are true or not. That's led to these unsupported claims. And again, the problem with this is you hear of the conspiracy theory issues. You're supporting it. I mean, there are groups out there that believe if you can do remote viewing, it's omnipotent. It's see all, know all. There are no secrets. The flip side of it, and we're going to do mind control with it and influence the whole world. And we're part of the Bilderbergers and the Trilateralists and the Council on Foreign Relations as part of the big with the Council on Foreign Relations on the study that led to the development of the joint non-lethal weapons policy. And I got to tell you, anybody who thinks that these are bodies that think in unanimity just haven't been in and watched what you almost describe as catfights going on over trying to defend various positions. So they're really come in with widely diverse opinions. What we suggest is, if you want to participate in areas of phenomenology, and there's a course that I teach in this area, I say, well, there's some things you probably ought to know if you're going to, before you step into the water, because it is not for the timid. First of all, you're often dealing with events that are hard to replicate. The data are often incomplete. Now, one of the problems in the use or application of remote viewing in the military cycles was, again, like with the police or law enforcement agencies, it's the court of last resort. I have absolutely no other way to get the information. Why not try it? And so then when you come up, when Paul was talking about it, it's not mental video, if you will. You know, as he mentioned, the psychics in the movies getting the license plates and seeing the offender and all that. What you get are bits and pieces of data. One of the big problems, and that has been a real, what I've called down here is the catch-22, is you're short on acceptable theory. The catch-22 that I mentioned here, what I run into with skeptics when they say, well, explain how it works. And you say, well, I'm not quite sure, you know, here are some of the theories. And they say, well, if you can't explain how it works, it doesn't exist. And you actually get caught up in that. It's kind of interesting because a lot of the early theories had to do with what you were dealing with was some kind of electromagnetic anomaly, if you will. We can envision, if you will, that there was an ELF wave of some kind, and that would not. Now, of course, the experiments that Stephen had done in submarines, as well as working with time, sort of mitigated against that. They had mentioned Cleve Baxter, and I worked with Cleve, and I was trying to replicate a device that he had. And so I needed an electrical engineer, and I took this very senior electrical engineer from Night Vision Lab out with me, and we saw the device. And what I was doing was we were taking oral leukocytes from the mouth, putting it in electrodes, and then remotely monitoring the emotional state of the individual. And last year I gave a more lengthy talk on it. But the individual, the double E who was out there with me said, look, you know, I understand the device is pretty simple to build, but there's a piece missing. And I said, well, no, the missing piece is my problem. Can you build the device? And he says, yeah, I can. But he said, look, and this was what I would call an honest skeptic, if you will. He says, look, I've cut this much out of the world for me. And you can move things around inside this circle all you want. But don't tell me something that says I have to relearn physics, because I don't want to hear it. And that's what you run into in a lot of this catch-22. I don't want to hear it. Now, the other thing that comes up in all of these things, they say, a priori, you know, all remote viewing experiments, all of this is fraud. You hear this all the time. I was out at SRI. I saw it as definitely fraud. One of the interesting stories there, I'll leave the guilty go unnamed, but a member of DARPA was sent out to watch some of the early experiments. Geller was actually there at the time doing it, and they sat in a room, and he did something like this, and he said, okay, I've drawn a design. What design have I drawn, you know? And, you know, if they were watching a hand movement, you could obviously tell that. So he went back and he said, I observed, you know, really poor methodology and protocol being used. Well, that was a true statement, but the problem was that it was his poor methodology, not they. I mean, Russ and Hal Puthoff and them learned very early on what it took to have very, very tight protocols. But nonetheless, this accusation of it's all fraud. And the other problem that comes up is that the opponents tend to argue emotion, and people who work in parapsychology, remote viewing, and studying phenomenology argue facts. And you end up in these discussions just talking right across each other. And so you ought to know that if you're going to get involved, that if you think you're going to go in and have a reasoned scientific debate with skeptics, you're going to be very surprised. And the other thing that happens out of this, we say the ad hominem attacks. One of my favorites was launched against me by very reputable. It was Scientific American. Ostensibly, the article that they were writing had to do with non-lethal weapons. And so we were talking about that. And then they said, oh, by the way, Alexander deals in this other strange stuff and all, and we had a go-round. The bottom line was a little blivet that came out by John Horgan at the end that basically said, since Alexander believes most things that most scientists don't, his judgment must be questioned. That's a pretty low blow. It wasn't about I disagree with any of the facts and all that. It's just that we will a priori say you are incapable of judgment. Been talking about skeptics and debunkers. If you're going to play in the field, be aware of that. Understand that your debates are not going to be scientific or academic, because I think the key issue here is that you're threatening them at the most fundamental level. It's not a matter of saying, is the sky really purple, or are we going to call it azure or something like that, things that you can debate and say, well, it's degrees of. Some of these issues, when you start talking about things like perturbation of time and space, we're talking about the most fundamental belief structure, and therefore the kinds of arguments that come back are very, very vicious and very emotional. Why is this a problem? This was a study that was done on, what are people's belief systems about phenomenology? On the left, you have the public saying we believe in psychic phenomena at a 65% level. When you get over to professors, seem to be more like it. But when you get into the National Academy of Science, you're down in the 3-4% range. When you have your leading scientists and the public so far out of whack, you've got to think that you're going to have a collision of beliefs. And of course, what happens in all governmental institutions, the way we deal with phenomena is you go and say, get me the best experts, and we'll get them together. And of course, the people you go to are over here in the National Academy of Sciences. Some of you may have known, I went head-to-head with them, and I think last year, and if we do this again, I'll come back and discuss it. We created a phenomenal event right in front of a board of the National Academy of Science. Again, it was at Cleve Baxter's laboratory, and it just doesn't exist. Again, we showed them the white crow. The white crow flew right in front of them, and when the report came out, it was like it just didn't happen. This just went into oblivion. Now, one of the things that gets mentioned is the ubiquitous thing, what you need are really good double-blind tests. I got to tell you, the people who do best at double-blind testing are parapsychologists. When a study was done, this was published in the Journal of Scientific Exploration a few years ago, and they went in and they looked at, by various kinds of disciplines, who did good double-blind testing. Now, you'd really expect, you always hear about, how good medical tests are. Double-blind, you've got to find testing for placebo effect and things like that. When you looked at the test, here they were at the 6% level, were actually double-blind tests. In the physical sciences, of course, they say we don't need to do it because hard things don't respond to influence. And yet parapsychologists who read their papers, 85% of them are in double-blind tests. So if there's anybody who's understood the necessity for covering their butt and doing double-blind testing. It's in the area that's studying this phenomenology. If you're going to play, there are some tough questions. One's who cares? Not a simple question. I'd suggest if you go out in this group, everybody say, wow, remote viewing is really important, studying phenomenology, studying eschatology based on the kind of responses we were getting here before. Very, very important issues. Go tell this to Joe Sixpack, and I've got to tell you, a lot of them you're going to find out really don't care. This also gets to be real tough when you start, people say, gee, if I only understood these things, the world is going to be a better place and we'd have, more peace and understanding. Ergo, people who contribute money to various kinds of foundations probably will show up in droves, and these issues are so important that, that they'll be funded. Not true. In fact, people give to very small, specific things they can tend to see, specific results on. There's a lot of things, and I'm kind of getting short on time, but if you're going to get involved, you really need to do kind of a cost-benefit analysis and be willing to put a lot personally online. We did talk, one of the considerations is, how to think out of the box. That seems to be one of the popular phrases now. And if you're involved in these studies, you certainly have to do this. One of the problems, I think, in most understandings is that our educational system is one that teach people to think as bricklayers. In other words, take a block, put the next block next to it, put the next one next to it, and build things up from the bottom up. But a friend of mine who ran the Air Command and Staff College, Colonel John Warden, who, by the way, also ran the Air War in Desert Storm, said, you got to think like an architect. So if you're going to approach these problems, then the thing to do is to think like an architect. How do the kinds of things I'm doing fit, and how do I design the system? By the way, I have found one of the things, I used to have a lot of, in my last job in the military, I had a lot of civilians. I was the only, we call green suitor in the organization. I had civilian scientists under. And these were pretty bright guys, all well schooled in their discipline. If you would tell them what to think about, they would do that. I found there are very few people who know how to think and can think independently. But if you ask them to solve specific problems, you can do that. I think one of the biggest problems we have is we don't know what problems we're trying to solve. And there's also a bottom issue, I think, is the bottom one. You got to dare to be wrong. We have developed a society that is really averse to being wrong. And we've thought that being wrong is equal to being bad. The reality is most people who have made major breakthroughs, major contributions at the same time have been wrong probably many more times than they've actually been right. It's just that when they were right, it was so significant it allowed the creativity to flow out. And the bottom line is, by the way, it says discovery consists of seeing what everyone else has seen and thinking what no one else has thought. I'd like to close with some thoughts from Albert Einstein. One is pretty well known, that great spirits have often encountered violent opposition from weak minds. If you're going to play in these areas, you're going to have to understand there will be a lot of opposition out there. The only real valuable thing is intuition. Trust intuition. It really is how advances are in fact made. Another one I liked was, you can't solve problems by doing the same kind of thinking that caused you to create the problem in the first place. What we tend to do in problem solving is do it harder, and that tends not to work. One, if you get emails from me that I send out, because I tend to dump the one on what I saw call for conspiracy theories. So there are two things that are infinite: the universe and human stupidity. And I'm not sure about the universe. I got to tell you, some of the stuff I read on the net. Okay, you want to bring the lights up? Are there any questions on anything that?
Yeah, I have two questions. Regarding secrecy, I've heard some, chilling rumors, but I'm curious what the mechanism is of classification as top secret and how something becomes declassified. What is the mechanism by which things become
classified? Okay, and declassified. Okay, there are two ways for things to become classified. A very small subset is in the nuclear arena. The laws were enacted that said, by its very nature, things about nuclear weapons are, quote, born classified. It's the only area where things are, by their very nature, from the time you think about it, classified. Beyond that, we have what we call derivative classifiers. These are people who are supposed to know about the topic. Then you have classification guides. And for any project, any technology, you have a very extensive classification guide that says the following information is considered confidential, the following level of information. Confidential means I'd rather it not get out, but okay. Secret starts to talk about grave damage to national security. Top secret says, really bad things are going to happen if this information is right. So there are people who go through courses that become derivative classifiers. For instance, when I was at Los Alamos and in the military, in certain areas I was a derivative classifier. So I could look at information about certain technologies and say this has the following, well, actually up to secret level. To get to top secret levels, it really takes a lot. And then now declassification is a similar process where there are certain timelines, but those are generally kind of go on. In fact, the Clinton administration had started a kind of global declassification process, and then they found out, oops, because certain information was getting out that they said that probably shouldn't have gone out just because of a certain length of time had elapsed. But it goes through a similar process where they look at it and said, okay, to say that the speed of light is no longer classified because X number of years, and everybody now knows that, and it's not going to hurt the world to understand those things. We will now release that information. Things that are protected most closely are what we call sources and methods. How did you get the information? How was it derived? What are the technologies involved? Some of it, one of the big examples in declassification, for instance, when the Cuban Missile Crisis came along, and they were trying to convince the United States that there was a problem in Cuba, and that was one of the first times they came out and said, okay, this is what overhead photography looks like. And that was a huge debate, because it's not just that you can take overhead pictures. How good is it? How frequently can you take it? What are specs? And more of that is now coming to light as you have civilian systems that have certain capability. But it goes through a very formal process. The problem is that we have so much information that is classified and in many cases overclassified that just the bureaucratic burden of going through and doing the declassification process, it's just overwhelming. I was doing a study on Phil Corso. Some of you will know that name, but a real enigma, and I won't get off into that. But I went back and I was looking for studies of the 1959 Army Science Board, and they were still classified. And they're in the National Archive. You look and say, what in the world, what science could have gone on in 1959 that would still be classified? The reality is none, but it's just too much of a bureaucratic hassle to declassify it, and nobody will wave a wand and say, in 40 years all this stuff ought to be already known.
You said that one of the problems during the Vietnam War was that you didn't see things coming. You didn't see the set fences and that sort of thing. I've made quite an extensive study of this pattern, and so I would ask you a question. Do you know where the orders to invade Vietnam and Korea came from?
Orders to invade Vietnam.
What was the influence that was used? I can tell you to say, stretch this out, the orders came from the Vatican.
I'm sorry, I find that going into conspiracy theory, and I don't think I don't think there are, we may have done some poor things, like the Gulf of Tonkin probably wasn't what it was cracked up to be, but I don't think we had external influence ordering the use of American armed forces. I'm sorry? Has Roswell been declassified? That's almost a whole nother discussion. If you believe the Air Force, they did a huge book. It's literally about this thick, called Roswell, the final chapter, or something like that. I mean, they claim yes. That's getting off in an area that is not classified. I come down, frankly, I think a very unusual event must have happened, just because of the number of things. I do not come down on the side of alien spacecraft crashing, and that runs counter to a lot of my friends and colleagues. But like I said, that's a whole different, probably a whole different discussion. Russ?
Can you tell us if there's any U.S. government support for ESP research at the present time?
The question is there government support for ESP research at the present time? In my estimation, not at an organizational level. And one of the things that I think is a problem is that people don't understand there are individuals who can hold one position as an individual and a different as being part of an institution. And I think institutionally that it's not there. You hear frequently, particularly on the Art Bell show and those, well, if it was so good, the program must be going on. I do not believe that to be the case, partly because most of the talent is here, or it's a very small talent pool that would be available. I think there are individuals, it's kind of like almost when you were starting. You found individuals who were quite supportive, some that were willing to go out on a limb. The problem today is you're operating from a zero-sum budget game. If I could be political, I think we have we stopped cutting fat from the military a long time ago. If you look at the force structure today compared to where we were, even 6 or 8 years ago, we are way, way below a safe level. There is no budget line that says go to war, so all of these exercises that we've been used in going into Bosnia and places like that around the world, mean the money has to come from something. R&D tends to be the area, and training and those areas are the ones that get cut first. So I think there are probably individuals who would be willing to be supportive. I don't think you'll find an institutional willingness to support it, and the biggest issue will be the bottom line of funding. By the way, I might point out one other thing that came out, $20 million was used over 20 years. Folks, in government R&D, that's in the noise. I mean, those are rounding errors. So you hear a lot of things about, oh my God, they spent 20 million. I mean, you're really talking amortized. That's $1 million a year, which may sound like a lot, but there's a lot going on. You really got a lot of bang for your buck for that. But that is not a huge amount of money by any stretch of the imagination. But right now, that kind of money would be tough to come by.
Is there an official government aerial spraying program?
Yeah, he wants to know about contrails. I don't know. I probably come down differently. I suspect not. I mean, it just does not, there's no logical reason that I can understand. I understand people taking a lot of pictures and that, and I'm probably not a good person to speak to it. My personal guess is no.
Did this obviously, a lot of this took place during the Cold War. Did the former Soviet Union have similar programs, and if they did, what were some of the major similarities?
The question is, was the former Soviet Union involved in looking at similar programs to this? The answer was yes. Their approach was much broader because they had we tended to take people from the intelligence community and train them as remote viewers. They had a broad sweeping program looking for people with natural talents and brought them in. Geller, there was an interesting session with Uri Geller, actually took place in the Capitol, because he had come and talking to a number of the Jewish immigrants who had come out, and a number of them had been forcefully recruited into a similar program. I did, actually in 1992 or 93, I was with General Stubblebine, and we had dinner with the director of the Institute of Theoretical Problems, who had an institute devoted to this study. And what amazed us was that, over dinner, we were trading information that 10 years ago we probably literally would have killed for. How are we doing on time, Paul?
Yeah. You mentioned Colonel Philip Corso earlier. Do you believe that the things that he and Bill Burns wrote in his book, Day After Roswell, are truthful and accurate?
You said one question. Well, that one question would take about an hour. The question was, Phil Corso wrote a book called The Day After Roswell. And the question was, do I believe that what he and Burns wrote was truthful and accurate? I'll be brief, and it might be the kind of thing to discuss it at a much, much longer period. We knew about Phil Corso long before the public did. And I had been to his home in Florida. I had met him. We knew about the book before it was written. A guy that I'd hoped to show up today, George Knapp, is the one who introduced us. He's a television reporter at Channel 8, was actually going to write the book with him. I spent a week in Washington checking out Phil Corso's background. I got to tell you, Phil is an absolute enigma. Twice prior to writing the Day After Roswell, he came forward and told very unusual stories. And these, we're talking about before Congress. The first one was about a shooting war that most of you didn't know was going on and had been going on. We and the Soviets had been duking it out. Shooting, and we had several hundred people who were lost. A lot of this was a cat and mouse game that was going on. We wanted to test the Soviet air defenses. We'd send planes in to have their radars come up. And it was a cat and mouse game. Every once in a while the cat won. And we were knocking folks down. They were being taken prisoner and carted off. Phil came out and discussed it, and lo and behold, people came clean. War had been going on. Second time he came forward, they were discussing. He had been in the White House, the White House staff, and they were talking about the KGB had a POW exploitation program that had been running for 50 years. They were capturing Americans at different places around the world. Some of them places you've probably never heard of before, but the Americans were being taken back, taken through Czechoslovakia, cleaned up, new identities, sent into the Soviet Union for technical exploitation, and then terminated because they were no longer useful. And of course, very few people knew about that sort of thing. The Cold War was a lot hotter than a lot of people know. And Phil came forward, and sitting next to him that time was a Czech general who said, I was the recipient of these people, and we would change their identity as they moved on.